The golden hour light stretched across the tall grass of the northern meadow, casting long, peaceful shadows. But as Elias approached the boundary of his property, the silence was shattered by a sound that made his blood turn to ice. His 14-year-old granddaughter Maya was screaming. He crested the hill and saw two men in tactical vests. The word enforcement was emblazoned across their backs in bold, yellow letters, topped by the circular seal of the Maplewood Estates HOA. They had Maya pinned between them. One man held her arms behind her back in a painful-looking wrist lock, while the other loomed over her, his face inches from hers. "Let me go. I'm on my grandpa's land. Get off me." Maya sobbed, her boots scuffing uselessly in the dirt. "You're being detained for multiple counts of loitering and unauthorized presence in a restricted zone," the larger man said, his voice a gravelly, practiced barrette. "You can cry all you want, kid. You're coming with us to the security office until the board decides how to handle your legacy status." Elias felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over him. This wasn't a misunderstanding about a fence line anymore. This was a kidnapping in progress. The roots of the rancor. To understand how two grown men felt empowered to put hands on a child in a cow pasture, one had to understand Karen Blake. Karen had been the president of the Maplewood Estates HOA for 6 years. To her, the HOA wasn't a civic organization, it was a sovereign nation, and she was its supreme commander. The only thorn in her side was the 100-acre thorn plot that sat like an island in the middle of her territory. The thorn land had been there since 1912. When the developers built Maplewood in the early 2000s, they tried to buy Elias out. He refused. They tried to sue for an easement. They lost. When Karen took over the board, she made it her personal mission to assimilate the thorn property. She had sent Elias hundreds of fines for the height of his grass, the color of his barn, and even the unauthorized smoke rising from his chimney in winter. Elias had responded to every single one with a polite, notarized letter from his attorney. As per County Record Book 42, page 12, this property is not, and has never been, subject to the covenants, conditions or restrictions of Maplewood Estates. Each rejection had driven Karen into a quiet, simmering madness. When Maya began spending her summers and weekends with Elias after her mother's passing, Karen found a new target. She viewed the girl's presence as loitering. She saw Maya's afternoon walks as scouting for criminal activity. 2 weeks prior to the incident, Elias had received a final notice from Karen. It wasn't a fine, it was a threat. "Since you refuse to acknowledge our authority, we have hired a professional enforcement tier to ensure the safety and compliance of our borders. Be advised, zero tolerance is now in effect." Karen hadn't hired a security company. She had hired 2 private contractors, men who had been dishonorably discharged from various security firms for excessive force. She gave them HOA cop badges and told them to fix the thorn problem. The breaking point. "Let her go," Elias said, his voice low and steady as he stepped into the field. The 2 men looked up. The one holding Maya's arms tightened his grip, causing her to wince. "Back off, old man," the second man said, stepping forward. He wore a utility belt loaded with handcuffs, a taser, and a heavy flashlight. "This is HOA business. The girl is under detention for trespassing and resisting an officer." "You aren't officers," Elias said, his eyes never leaving the man holding Maya. "You are private citizens on private property. You are currently committing a felony." The man in front laughed, a jagged mocking sound. "We've got a contract that says otherwise. And as for the girl? Karen told us she needs a lesson in respect. We're taking her back to the holding room at the clubhouse. Maybe after a day or 2 in the dark, she'll learn to stay off the HOA's grass." The man holding Maya leaned in, whispering loud enough for Elias to hear, "Yeah, she's gonna be real quiet by the time we're done with her." In that moment, the world narrowed to a single point. Elias saw the terror in Maya's eyes, the bruises forming on her wrists, and the predatory smirk on the man's face. He recognized the intent. This wasn't about a neighborhood dispute. It was an unlawful abduction of a minor with the explicit intent to cause harm. Elias was 70 years old, but he was a man who had spent his life working the earth. He moved with a sudden violent efficiency that the enforcers never expected from an old man. The confrontation was over in less than 60 seconds. When the dust settled, the larger enforcer lay still in the tall grass. The second was on the ground, clutching a shattered shoulder, his authority bleeding out into the dirt. Elias didn't run. He pulled Maya to his chest, shielding her eyes, and dialed 911. The day of reckoning. The investigation was the most thorough the county had seen in decades. Because it involved the death of a security guard, the district attorney initially looked at Elias with a heavy eye. However, the HOA cops had been arrogant. They had been wearing body cams to record their victories for Karen. The footage recovered from the scene was damning. It captured the men laughing as they grabbed Maya. It captured the blatant statement that they intended to hold her for days to teach her a lesson. It captured the fact that they were standing 30 yards inside Elias's marked property line. As the police dug deeper, they seized Karen Blake's phone. The messages they found were the final nail in the coffin. Karen, I don't care how you do it. Snatch the brat. If the old man sees, let him watch. Make them realize I run this valley. Teach her a lesson she won't forget. Karen Blake was arrested during an HOA board meeting. The image of her being led out in handcuffs, screaming about architectural integrity, was captured by a dozen cell phones. She was charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, false imprisonment of a minor, and impersonation of a peace officer. The judge showed no mercy. During sentencing, he looked at Karen and said, "You turned a neighborhood association into a paramilitary cult. You used the guise of community standards to justify the terrorization of a child." Karen received 20 years in state prison. The wounded enforcer received 15. The fallout for Maplewood Estates was total. The civil suit filed by Elias and Maya's estate resulted in a $4.5 million judgment. The HOA, having spent its reserves on private enforcement and legal fees, was forced into a catastrophic bankruptcy. The gated community was forced to take down its gates, sell off its common areas, and dissolve the association entirely. Reflection in the quiet. A year later, the meadow was quiet again. The fence remained, but the enforcement signs were gone, replaced by wildflowers. Maya sat on the porch with Elias, a book in her lap. She still had nightmares, but she no longer jumped at the sound of a car door closing. She looked at her grandfather, the man who had always been gentle, who had only ever used his hands to build and plant, until the moment he had to protect. Elias looked out over his land. He thought about the men in the vests and the woman in the office. He realized that the greatest danger in the world isn't the bad guy in the shadows. It's the person who believes that a title, a badge, or a uniform gives them the right to be cruel without consequence. True authority, he knew, wasn't the power to command others. It was the responsibility to protect the vulnerable and the courage to stand when the world tried to tell you that might makes right.